I've been making a game called Burn It All Down, but for the past year and a half of development, there has been no fire. It's literally in the title, yet up until recently, you couldn't set anything on fire. So in this devlog, I'll show you how I've added fire to the game. Welcome to devlog 4 of Burn It All Down. For the past 2 months, I've been working on implementing fire into the game. Burning things down, blowing stuff up, overcooking the bunning snags, and causing all sorts of mayhem. From burning forests in Minecraft to weed fields in Far Cry, fire has always been an easy sell to me. Something about it really scratches the lizard part of my brain.
Shut up and take my money!
From the very beginning of my game, fire has been one of the major selling points, and I'm super keen to show you how I've implemented it. So firstly, I wanted the player to feel like they're the ones responsible for creating the destruction, and I couldn't think of a better way than allowing the player to pour a canister of oil over whatever they wanted to burn and setting it alight with a Zippo lighter. So I got to work by making myself a jerry can in Blender and throwing it into Unity. I made the canister heavy to pick up and gave it some impact sounds that really helped sell its physicality to the player. I then began creating the jerry can's behavior script. This would control the way the canister acts based on how the player interacts with it. To begin with, I decided to tackle the pouring mechanic, as it's the one thing I could test without having to put my headset on 1,000 times. To create the pouring effect, I decided on a raycast method, which is simply shooting an invisible laser in a direction and getting feedback when it hits something.
Shit.
I started by shooting a line 1 meter upwards in a 45-degree angle and then straight down to the floor. I expanded upon this by calculating the current rotation of the canister by using a funky method that I definitely came up with and only allowing the raycast to shoot when a certain angle had been met. I then added some particle effects to the hit position of the raycast and began playing around to achieve the best results. This was easier said than done, however, as I couldn't stop encountering bugs, like lots of bugs. Because of this, I ended up scrapping the canister behavior and switched to using a prefab method of spawning the oil. This method involves spawning an object at a certain point as opposed to a raycast and giving it a spawn rate and force. This way I could rely on Unity's physics engine to ensure that the oil hits the ground correctly. To my surprise, this worked really well and felt much better than the janky raycast system that I was working with before. I re-added the tilt functionality to the canister and made sure that if the tilt angle was less than the threshold, the pouring would stop. From here, I created a few textures for the canister by taking some photos of some jerry cans that my dad had in his garage. I also replaced the donut with the oil puddle effect from earlier and added a pouring effect that spills from the oil spawn point. The final thing needed to sell the idea was a lid, which was more difficult than I first thought, but ended up working really well. And with all this, I finally have a functioning jerry can with oil physics to boot. This is when I decided to tackle the elephant in the room.
Jesus!
Adding the fire, which was really easy to do once I forked out the cash to pay for the Ignis asset on the Unity asset store. I spent a few days playing around and learning the asset before finally implementing it within my project. I made all wooden objects flammable and break upon being burnt. I expanded upon my explosive script by allowing explosive objects to blow up when being on fire for too long, and created a few fire-specific assets such as the fire barrel, which has its own tilt behavior script that allows coals to spill when being tipped over. From here, I made it so that the oil spills from the jerry can actually creates puddles, which is just a simple texture I made combined with a decal projector within Unity. And at this point, I needed a way for the player to set fire to the oil, so I began creating the Zippo lighter. As always, I began by creating the model within Blender and giving it some animations and sounds within Unity. I made it a grabbable object and invoked an event upon a button press. This plays the sounds, animations, and causes a flame to appear, which can be used to set things on fire. It took a while to figure this one out, but in doing so, I have opened the doors to an array of fun interactable objects that I can now make. One of which will be C4, but that'll be added later. With the Zippo lighter done, I was now able to set fire to the oil. But what's the point in all this anarchy if you can't burn your enemies? I began by making the enemies burn like any other object. With this, I added a take fire damage method within the enemy's health script that deducts a certain amount of health per second depending if the enemy is on fire or not. After working on this, I began tackling the behavior of the enemy. I wanted them to run around like crazy, ignoring all other set behaviors and just focus on being on fire. I had a lot of trouble when trying to figure this one out, as I'm simply not at the level needed to manipulate the codebase of the AI asset that I've been using.
How the fuck does that even make sense? What the huh? What is that?
That's not to say I didn't give it a red hot crack, but after a few days of non-stop trial and error, I decided to do what any sane man working a full-time job would do and get my wallet out yet again. I kindly asked the developer of Blaze AI if he could do me a huge favor, and within the hour he got back to me with something I couldn't even get close to in days. Money well spent, I'd say. Anyway, go buy his asset, it's the best. I quickly followed this by making a burning animation and implementing it within my game. It worked flawlessly. With all this heat, I needed a break, so I took a trip to the wrong side of Australia and went snowboarding with Kevin! We also climbed Big Rock, but all of this climbing got me thinking, what if I didn't have arms? How would I climb Big Rock? Wouldn't I just fall? And legs, how would I go snowboarding with Kevin? Anyway, upon my return, I added arms and legs to the player, and implemented the ability for the player to burn. This was easy enough, as the groundwork was already done within the enemy health script. I just needed to copy and paste the methods over and change some variable names. With this, the player now dies when standing in fire for too long, taking 11 out of 100 damage per second and being on fire for 5 seconds at a time. This means that the player has one chance to survive when being set on fire. I also updated the screen damage effect to flash repeatedly when the player burns, and took the time to add sounds for when the player takes damage and dies, which sounds kinda familiar. Anyway, I then added a utility belt to the player so you can hold various small items such as bottles, or more importantly, the Zippo lighter. This opens up huge amounts of potential, as the player can now choose when and where to use items, rather than having to carry them around everywhere by hand. And lastly, I added a burnable object method to my game manager script. This allows me to set specific objects or structures as objectives that the player has to burn to complete a mission or level. With all this working, and surprisingly well, I can finally get to working on the look of the game and preparing it for a public alpha build. I don't know when this will be ready, but here's a rough idea of what I'll be working on next. I'll be creating a Steam and Meta store page, which of course then needs a trailer, so I think my main focus from here on out will be getting the look of the game sorted so that I can create a trailer and finally have a storefront for the project. If you've enjoyed this video and are keen to see more, please consider liking and subscribing. I read every comment and piece of feedback, so leave a message either in the comments below or over on my Discord, and I'll make sure I get back to you. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching and cheers.